This is Strange New Trek, a podcast about the life and times of Captain Christopher Pike. This episode of Strange New Trek is sponsored by The Time Warp in Ashland, Kentucky. And now your hosts. Episode 4, Forbidden Podcast. A spacecraft travels to a distant planet to discover the fate of a group of scientists sent there decades earlier. When the commander and his crew arrive, they discover survivors and amongst them a beautiful young woman. But this planet hides a dangerous secret, and we are of course discussing the 1956 classic Forbidden Planet. This week we are discussing the similarities between Star Trek The Cage and Forbidden Planet. I am your host, Jeremy Vilmer. And joining us now, our co-host and cook, Chris Noonian Singh.
I feel like I've said this before, but...
It gets better every time.
Why am I downgraded to cook?
It's not a downgrade. Again, I find the cook to be one of the better characters in the show.
Yeah, he's saying again. This is like the third time we've recorded this intro.
We have had almost every single possible problem happen so far, but... The one thing I dislike about the cook is he seems to believe that bourbon comes from Kansas City.
Yeah.
Hey, Chris, so this is your first viewing of Forbidden Planet. What were your impressions?
Yeah, I'd never seen this before. Going through it, it's obviously a product of its time in a lot of areas, which I'm sure we'll delve into. The main thing that struck me, pretty much the same as The Cage, is just visually how good it looked. I was a real fan of that. Plus, we get to see a young Leslie Nielsen, which I only know him from the Naked Gun movies.
Oh, yeah. This is him in his leading man days.
It was definitely weird seeing him, first of all, young, and second of all, doing something serious.
Yeah. What was nice is he wasn't even like super hammy in the role. It was only like a little bit campy, you know? Because a lot of early sci-fi, man, they go way over the top and out into the left field when they do it.
Yeah, this movie was fairly subdued in that arena. Like, I mean, obviously some of the stuff was pretty far out, but no, I thought they did a good job keeping it sort of grounded. At least given what had all come after that in cinema, I guess.
Right. Well, and this movie, as we'll discover, is kind of the progenitor of a lot that would happen in sci-fi and science fantasy after this point. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of go through the plot of the movie and make some discussions and some notes as we go, and then we are going to compare it to Star Trek, but specifically The Cage. Starship C-57D reaches the distant world Altair 4 to determine the fate of an Earth expedition sent there 20 years earlier. Dr. Edward Morbius, one of the expedition scientists, unsuccessfully tries to persuade the relief ship not to land, saying he cannot guarantee their safety.
Yeah, the one thing that I really like about this opening scene is the fact that they use the flying saucer as the ship that they're on. I feel like you don't see that too much. We kind of use the flying saucer as the other spaceship, so it was cool to see our Earthlings rolling up on this planet in a flying saucer. I liked it.
Now that you say that, I've never really thought about it, but off the top of my head, I don't know of another show or movie where human beings are flying around in a flying saucer. It's always like rocket-shaped or plane-shaped or ship-shaped.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess Star Trek comes a little bit close, but it's like a saucer with all sorts of stuff attached to it, so I don't know if you can still even count that.
Yeah, I don't really count the Enterprise as a flying saucer, but this particular flying saucer is just, I guess during that time, to begin with, like every report of a, UFO that somebody's seen close seems like this is the kind of ship they were seeing. So it's kind of cool, again, that the humans were on that ship instead of them making it like the other, race or whatever you want to call an alien.
Sure. I guess this was also the first time that a human manned and built craft was shown to go faster than light.
Yeah, I guess we take that for granted now in our sci-fi. You don't even have to have it explained to you much. Not that they explained it at all here either, but yeah, we take it for granted now. But this is pretty much the first time. Yeah, for sure.
Nowadays, everybody kind of understands that you'd have to go at a certain speed to go from here to another star. Back then, I don't know how widespread that knowledge would have been.
Yeah, that is weird to think about. Like, I don't know what science looked like back then. I'm sure Einstein was around with the relativity and all that, but yeah, that's crazy.
But just part of the zeitgeist, I don't know how much it was, but I remember even just back in the 90s, we didn't know yet if there were planets around the other stars or if it was just us.
Yeah, I'm always waiting for first contact. I hope I'm alive when it happens, for better or worse. I just want to be alive when it happens.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a little bit more of a problematic thing for certain fundamentalists in our society than we think, which I think the long-reaching reverb of that is going to be pretty nasty. But, yeah, I'd like to see it too, good or ill. Okay, so now Commander John J. Adams, Lieutenant Jerry Farman, and Lieutenant Doc Ostro are all met by Robbie the Robot, who transports them to Morbius's residence. Morbius describes how one by one the rest of the expedition was killed by an unknown planetary force that vaporized their starship, the Bellerophon, I'm going to mess that up every time, as the last survivors try to lift off. Only Morbius, his wife, who later died of natural causes, and their daughter Altiera were somehow immune. Morbius offers to help them prepare for their return journey, but Adams says, no, that's okay. We're gonna stick around until I hear from Earth.
Let me just say, Robbie the Robot looks like I can see where Fallout got its Protectrons from. If you have ever played any of the Fallout games, like this is pretty much a dead ringer of a Protectron in Fallout.
Absolutely. I think Robbie the Robot might have one of the longest sci-fi careers of any particular thing that was built. He shows up in Mork and Mindy 23 years after this. I mean, he's been in a lot of stuff over the years.
Yeah, plus like how many times people have modeled different robots off of him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was funny to see that, given, I'm a big Fallout fan, so as soon as I saw that, that's all I could think about.
Oh, yeah. And I bet you if you went and you look, because Fallout was really good at drawing their influences, from popular science fiction and other things. So I bet you if you talk to the art director or whatever artist came up with those Protectrons, they would just basically say, yeah, it was Robbie the Robot. So here we see that the C-57D really has like a lead of three people, the commander, the lieutenant, and Doc Ostro.
Man, that sounds familiar.
It does. It sounds really familiar. So then we go to the next day. Adams finds Farman teaching Altiera how to kiss. Furious, he dismisses Farman and berates Altiera for her naivety and revealing clothing. She reports the incident to Morbius, who says she never needs to see Adams again, but Altiera designs a new, more conservative gown to please Adams. That night, an invisible intruder sabotages the equipment aboard the starship. Adams and Ostro confront Morbius the following morning. While waiting for him to exit his study, Adams steps outside to talk to Altiera. Adams apologizes for his behavior and they kiss. They are attacked by a tiger, and Adams disintegrates the animal, which had previously been tame in Altiera's presence.
Ooh. Yeah, this is definitely a problematic scene.
It is, because well, first off, when she says, don't you want to kiss me like everybody else? Then you're kind of like, oh, God, how many, and then it kind of seems like he's like, no, that's creepy and weird. And then he's like, all right, yeah, let's give this a shot here. And then his false modesty, he thinks she's bathing naked in this lake and he's not going to look, but keeps peeking over his shoulder. It's just, I don't know, all of it is just bad. It's like the whole thing with her being involved is like watching kids play doctor almost, but like one of the kids is older and it shouldn't be happening.
That is the perfect, most disgusting way to put it. When the other guy is trying to convince her to kiss him, obviously that's pretty bad. But the commander comes on scene and is like, hey, man, why don't you stop that? Gives him a dress down. So I liked him. I liked where it was going. And then he busts out the, well, you shouldn't be dressed like that.
Yeah, now the victim blaming kicks in.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a thing for all this old stuff that we watch. Well, this might be the last old thing we watch for a while, but regardless, I understand the time and all that stuff. But so there's some stuff I'll judge from my perch here in 2020, and some things I won't. This is the thing that I think I will probably keep coming back to.
I feel perfectly fine commenting on it. Just because, I mean, even if this was like the social norm, this is why we leave some things in the past.
Yeah, but then like he dresses his guy down and then turns right around and does the same thing.
Yeah, that is not cool. I mean, there's no way to look at that and go like, yeah, I agree with that behavior. You know? And also, I don't know if it was me or what, but the tiger appears to be like the horny police in this movie. Tiger was cool, just like hanging out, getting petted, being treated like a normal kitty cat. And then once the hanky panky starts, the tiger's going to eat them.
Yeah, I didn't pick up on that while I was watching it, but now that you say that, it does make a lot of sense that they that's the case.
A little odd. This is the one time I'm going to say something creepy, but Anne Francis looks amazing in this movie. Yeah, her costumes, kind of revealing for the time, but nothing tasteless or over the top or weird or, whatever. The first time I remember seeing this, like watching it, and it wasn't just like a Saturday morning thing that came on in the background. First time I actually sat down to watch it, I was like, that girl is like amazingly pretty. So I believe she went on to have a very long and fruitful career in acting. So fantastic. Didn't end up doing silly movies like Leslie Nielsen did, so probably a tie, I guess. He at least had the longevity of the career just because of his ability to switch genres.
I mean, to be fair, women at that time, once they kind of aged out of these types of roles, they weren't picked up for a whole lot, I don't think.
Yeah, you had a career till you're about 30, Well, and you go and watch now, there's like movies where Tom Cruise is pushing 60 and his love interest is like a 22-year-old actress.
It does seem like that.
Yeah, and they'll tell actresses who are like 30, like, oh no, you're too old to be the love interest. Okay, but he's 58.
Yep, still too old, sorry. I feel like that's changing now, though, which is good.
It is, to a certain degree. Well, we'll see how things go. They're definitely having to fill more hours of entertainment now, so they're going to have to be open to doing different things now. Okay, upon Morbius's appearance, Adams and Ostro learn he has been studying the Krell, a highly advanced native race that perished overnight 200,000 years before. In a Krell laboratory, Morbius shows them a plastic educator, a device capable of measuring and enhancing intellectual capacity. When Morbius first used it, he barely survived, but his intellect was permanently doubled. Morbius then takes them on a tour of a vast 20-mile square Krell underground machine complex, still functioning powered by 9,200 thermonuclear reactors. Afterwards, Adams demands that Morbius turn over his scientific discoveries to Earth. Morbius refuses, claiming that humanity is not yet ready to receive such limitless power.
Man, that scene, I remember I was kind of like live texting you while I was watching this last night. This scene is the one where I was like, oh, I'm getting Star Wars vibe here. Somebody's about to lose a hand. It definitely reminded me of that scene in Cloud City where Luke loses his hand to Darth Vader. I just got all kinds of Star Wars vibes like that from this scene. It looked amazing, though.
It did. It looked really good. I have to assume all that was matte paintings because there would be no other way to do that back then.
I read a lot about those when I was a kid. I forgot just how incredibly talented all those people were working on those paintings, man. Because they, especially in this movie and in The Cage too, utterly fantastic.
Yeah, especially when you get into like the ones where they're painting layered glass to give it real depth and everything. It just, some of the stuff they used to do to create the environments and make them look like, whatever it was they were supposed to look like is just incredible. The things they would do, forced perspective and layered matte paintings and creative lighting. There was real artistry back then.
Yeah, I mean, not that there's not now, but they just had to do it differently.
And cheaper. Because you know what? I used to get a lot of those like Starlog and, the horror and sci-fi magazines that were out when I was a kid.
I remember those.
Yeah, Fangoria, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I definitely remember Fangoria.
And I don't even know how I got these, but they would show like how you would shoot a model in way extreme foreground with a wide lens, and you'd have like your actors like 600 feet away, and you could make it look like they were walking up the ramp into this model starship. Just the creativity, because they're doing things that had never been done. That's what was kind of wild about some of it.
Yeah, that must have been cool, like being on that kind of cutting edge of what was going on in cinema at that time.
Yeah, that would have been wild. So how about Morbius has decided he can choose what humanity gets to learn and what they don't?
Last night The whole time I'm sitting here watching this with my wife, and I'm thinking, why the hell does Jeremy want to watch this? I don't really see any similarities to The Cage. And then I felt like every time I said that to myself, something else popped up that was pretty similar.
Well, you know what was funny is last night as I was trying to watch it, my son and oldest grandson came by. And when Micah was standing in the room for a second, he looks at the TV and he goes, "Is this The Cage?" And I was like, "No." Because it looks like The Cage a little bit. I know that. Yeah, it does a little bit. Yeah, you kept texting that, and I'm thinking, God, am I that far off base? And then as I'm watching, I'm like, no, I'm still right. All right, so then, in response to the sabotage, Adams orders a force field fence deployed around the starship. It proves ineffective when the intruder returns and murders Chief Engineer Quinn. Morbius warns Adams that he had a premonition of further deadly attacks, similar to what happened to the Bellerophon. I think I got it that time. That night, so. Yeah, thank you. That night, the invisible creature returns and is outlined in the fence's force field. The ship's weapons have no effect, and it kills Farman and 2 others. Morbius, asleep in the Krell lab, is startled awake by screams from Altiera. At the same instant, the roaring creature vanishes.
Yeah, so I've said over and over again here how good this looks, especially when you consider it's 1956. But the scene that really stands out to me is during this whole thing where you see what we later know is the id monster or whatever, walking invisibly through the terrain, and you just see the footprints making imprints as it's going. That whole scene, to me, just how well it was done, it looked like it wouldn't be out of place in like a modern Jurassic Park movie. How good it looked, as far as the ground falling away at each step. For everything good I'll say about the visuals in this movie, that one scene in particular stands out to me probably more than any of the other ones, except for maybe when we actually see the id monster.
And also, because when it gets to the end of the camp, it goes up into the starship. And you see steps bend as it's walking.
Oh, yeah, I forgot that it did that too.
It really just gives a sense of weight to an invisible creature. And let's face it, you make an invisible creature because they're too expensive to do in any other way.
Yeah. I thought visually this movie looks good anyway, but for me, that was like the quintessential best looking scene to me, I think.
No, it really added just some believability. You know what I did notice here, and I didn't really note anywhere except like try to remember, they put large guns outside the ship and power them from the ship, kind of like what they do in The Cage.
Yeah, but at least their ship was on the ground pretty close to their guns.
This is true, yeah. I guess their microwave beams didn't have to reach as far, Later, while Adams tries to persuade Altiera to leave, Ostro sneaks away to use the Krell educator. With his dying breath, Ostro explains to Adams that the underground machine was built to materialize anything the Krell could imagine. He says that the Krell forgot one thing: monsters from the id. Adams asserts that Morbius' subconscious mind created the creature that killed the members of the original expedition and attacked his crew. Morbius refuses to accept the accusations. No, it's not me.
Yeah, Mr. Double My IQ.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it just goes to show you even smart people can rationalize bad ideas, and that's what you're seeing right there.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially since it implicates him in the deaths of a lot of people.
Yeah, well, and I think we all have a blind spot as far as our own bad decisions and bad actions go, but it's just a smarter person could probably do a better job convincing themselves it's not their fault.
Yep. And I mean, you see that even today, especially today, with all the conspiracy thinking afoot, even with highly educated people. So, yeah, you're right. It just makes it easier for them to rationalize their bad ideas.
Yeah, I've never really been a big conspiracy guy because my fear is once you buy one, all the rest are easier to believe. You know what I mean? It's like once you go for one of them, then they all start, I guess that makes a little bit of sense,
Yeah, I've often wanted to dip my toes in that stuff, but I think I have the same fear as you. Like, one, I might start believing it, and then two, like you said, like it might get me down the rabbit hole a lot more.
In for the penny, in for the pound is kind of what happens. For me, what a big thing was when I was a kid, I was like started to get into that whole like Kennedy assassination thing. And then I saw my dad and my grandfather pull off 3 really fast shots with a Carcano and hit some shit that I didn't think would be possible because I'd been told nobody could do that with an Italian bolt-action rifle. And I saw them both do it back to back. And I was like, okay, I guess a retrained sharpshooter could pull those shots off. Never mind.
We could do a whole 500 episodes about just that.
Yes.
So let's not delve into that. I think that's like the gateway drug in all of that is the Kennedy assassination.
I think so. But yeah, so that's kind of where I was coming from with it. It's just the smarter you are, it's probably the better you are at convincing even yourself that that's the case. After Altira tells Morbius that she intends to leave with Adams, Robbie detects a creature approaching. Morbius commands the robot to kill it, but Robbie knows it's a manifestation of Morbius, and Robbie shuts down. They actually demonstrate this earlier in the movie. The monster melts through the almost indestructible Krell metal doors of the laboratory where Adams, Altira, and Morbius have taken refuge. Morbius finally accepts the truth. He confronts and disowns the creature, but is fatally injured. Before Morbius dies, he has Adams unknowingly initiate a chain reaction within the Krell reactors, saying that they must be in deep space within 24 hours. At a safe distance, Adams, Altira, Robbie, and the surviving crew witness the destruction of Altira 4. So, for me, as this ends, I can see them setting off onto a next adventure quite easily.
Yeah, they definitely gave themselves a lot of latitude, if that was even on their mind back then. Because I know sometimes they made movies with a kind of open-ended ending. Well, I guess we still do that today, so it's not entirely out of the ordinary. But yeah, there's definitely room for more stories to be told in that world for sure. And I'm actually surprised it hasn't happened yet. I know there's been a couple times where they've tried to do remakes or sequels or whatever, and it's just never happened for one reason or another. So given that, like you said earlier, this is like the progenitor of most of our modern sci-fi, it seems weird to me nobody has really revisited this world before.
Yeah, there's a lot you could do with it. Just from this one movie, there are a lot of directions you could go. There are Shakespearean pieces and there's Lovecraft, all sorts of directions you could take this. You could do a related story. You could do a completely new Planet of the Week story.
Yeah, and, Leslie Nielsen definitely plays a competent starship commander. Tell me the bridge of that ship didn't look like the inside of the TARDIS, the modern one. A little bit.
No, I could definitely see that because they kind of have that submarine control at the center of the room.
Yeah, with the big ball thing.
Yeah. What I thought was funny is that the beds were all spread around the bridge.
Yeah, that was weird. But, I mean, you don't get a huge sense of scale of the ship, but what little bit you do see poking out of the edge of the scenes where they're, setting up stuff in front of it, it looks pretty small. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that their beds would be like that. But to me, though, with as much thought as it seems was put into this movie, that is not a ship for long-range star travel, with it being so small like that.
No, it does not seem like an exploratory vessel. It feels like a submarine meant to do short jogs, blow something up, and get back home,
Yeah. They could have spun this out in many different ways. Again, I'm surprised this never happened.
Before we move on to comparisons directly to Star Trek and The Cage, you got anything else you want to add? Because this was your first go-through, and I want your general impressions.
Generally, the movie was good. I mean, except for the icky scene.
Mm-hmm.
I could have done without that. I think I read somewhere when they showed it to kids, they cut that scene out, which, cool, man.
I would hope so.
In any case, again, visually, stunning movie. I was constantly surprised by how good this movie looked. The main thing that I really hated was the soundtrack. The soundtrack was, I get it, this was the first movie to feature an all-electronic soundtrack. I understand all of that, but at times it almost made this movie unwatchable for me because of the noises.
It's jarring at points.
It's some of it, yeah.
Where you're just like, oh, what is that? Overall, I like this movie. Usually, I'm not overly familiar with it. I've seen it who knows how many times. They used to play it on weekends on like the sci-fi feature pieces and things like that when I was a kid. But it's not one that like I have completely memorized. It's more one I know by the feel of the movie than I do the actual scene by scene. I am not overly familiar with Shakespeare, but apparently, whether it was meant to or not, this shares a lot in the story with The Tempest. So I don't know if that was intentional or not. I didn't look too far into it. It just, I happen to know there's only like 9 stories you can tell. So even accidentally, you can do it.
And Shakespeare was probably the first one to tell all 7 of them. So obviously everything's going to look like something from him.
Yeah. Yeah, everything's going to tie back to Shakespeare at some point.
It's like, what's that game people play on Wikipedia with Kevin Bacon? 7 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. I think you can play that with cinema, 7 Degrees of William Shakespeare. Storytelling, not necessarily cinema, but storytelling in general.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it makes me think like if I could find a good version of The Tempest, I'd want to watch it and compare that to Forbidden Planet to The Cage and see how many things I could put together there.
Let's keep going back. At the end of this series, we'll be talking about a series of images on a cave wall in France somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so before we actually get into it then, because you did text me a couple times, like, what does this have to do with Star Trek? We're going to get into the actual comparisons here in a second, but before we do that, I want to thank the Time Warp in Ashland, Kentucky for being a sponsor of our show. The Time Warp in Ashland they have 2 locations. They specialize in new and classic video games, pro wrestling stuff, comic books, classic movies, card games, just about everything a nerdy person could want. If you don't live in that area, you can find them on Facebook and buy the stuff from them on Mercari. So, as I said last week, if you've got a nerdy itch, they can scratch it.
Yeah, I checked out their site, and I'm definitely eyeballing a few things. So, yeah, we definitely appreciate the Time Warp sponsoring these first few episodes while we get our feet wet.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you guys. Thank you, Earl. We do appreciate it. All right, Chris, I gotta go into this now, and I'm going to use you to bridge me into it. You ready?
Alrighty.
Okay, so last night as you're watching this, you send me a couple texts asking, hey, Jeremy, what does this movie have to do with Star Trek?
Yeah, and it felt like every time I asked that, the question was immediately answered on screen. So
I want to just kind of pull some things out that I just threw on notes, and I'm hoping these will lead us into more things as we go. But the story was very much a Planet of the Week story, which is literally the wording right out of Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek is.
Yeah. And not to mention, it's not necessarily a signal they're getting from this failed expedition, but that is just their mission altogether, it seems like. So there are definitely some similarities right there, even right out the gate.
Yep, because even if it's not a directly parallel to, it is kind of a branch off of the same idea. They get to the planet, and of course, there are survivors to this lost expedition who are covering up a mystery. And both, I got to say, how'd this hot blonde chick get here?
Yeah, both feature pretty young ladies.
Yeah, everybody else here was 80, and here's this, pretty 20-year-old girl. Where'd she come from? There's also the question on both planets, like, where are the original inhabitants? With the Telosians, there were only a few surviving from a nuclear war. With the Alterans, none of them are left. They disappeared over one night. But still, a dying race and a dead race are pretty similar. We also get into, right off the top, Star Trek The Cage, you had Pike, number 1, and Spock. Here you've got Adams, Ostro, and Farman. While not an identical trio, still pretty close. You have the commander, the lieutenant, and the scientist.
Yeah, I mean, even in later episodes of Star Trek, Bones would often accompany them too. And pretty much in threes. So you knew watching one of those older episodes, if there was more than 3 of them and you didn't know 2 of them, if you didn't know the other one's names, they were probably wearing red shirts and about to die.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a good case of that. Hey, Ensign Barney, come here for a minute, would you? Yeah, that was one thing. I did not care for the costume design in this very much, but it did have that kind of classic, like, sci-fi uniform look.
You know what, man? I go the opposite on this. Their uniforms were actually kind of simpler than I would have expected for some sci-fi this time. It kind of reminds me of the uniforms they had in Enterprise.
I could see that. And you know what, also now that as soon as I get that out of my mouth, yeah, they had that one set of uniforms that were like the big fluffy ones with like a lot of patchwork and the big V-neck. Then they also had a handful that were just like a button-up shirt with a collar and slacks, which really just looked like a Navy uniform.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what you're supposed to assume. I mean, even in other sci-fi, I think it's normally the Navy that kind of takes over spacefaring. I guess a combination of like naval forces and like Air Force, what would be equivalent to, right now. But yeah, I thought their uniforms were pretty simple and utilitarian. Like I had no issues with them. I thought they looked good.
Their personal equipment, they had like a little communication microphone doodad that was kind of bungee, or what would you call that? Like rip corded to their belts. You had a personal blaster. It's still a lot of stuff that was very much like Star Trek equipment.
Yeah, I think even the blasters that they carried in this kind of reminded me of the ones that they carried in the Cage. There's a little bit of differences, but overall, they look pretty similar.
Yeah, I kind of got that sense. Acting style between this and the Cage seemed very similar. They're kind of that holdover from stage acting to screen acting.
Yeah, that makes sense. You definitely see a lot of that in Leslie Nielsen as a commander here, mirrored in what Mr. Hunter did for Pike. Adams shows a little bit more emotional range than Pike does, and it was kind of funny. There was even a scene where they all go down to that intelligence machine. I forget exactly what it was called, but Morbius gets up there and the meter or whatever it is, almost fills up all the way, and then the other two guys, Adams and one of his compatriots, they can barely get it a quarter to a half of the way. So he makes a statement like, "Oh, well, the captain doesn't have to be smart; it just has to be loud." And that definitely reminded me of some of even your descriptions of Pike in the last episode that we did.
Very shouty. Very shouty. There were a couple things, and I wish I'd been taking better notes. There were a couple things in here that were said by Farman to Adams that reminded me of descriptions like Boyce or somebody else would say about Pike in the episode. Now, I'm just trying to remember what they were, but they were ones that were basically, along the lines of treating the crew a little bit better than he would treat himself, or, things like that.
Yeah, I definitely heard some of that come up.
So, Chris, I think I got a little too close to it after you would ask me what it had to do with Star Trek, but did you see any similarities between the characters of, say, like Alta and Vina, or maybe one of the other crew members of the ship?
Oh, for sure. They're both kind of naive about what's going on. In fact, I think even Vina doesn't really have... I mean, she crashed there, obviously, but she didn't have... Well, I got to step back for a second. The Vina that we first meet, the young-looking one, the way that she is acted is she's not very familiar with human men. Obviously, later on in the episode, turns out that that's not the case because she's way older than they made her out to be. But they still play the same initially. So there's some pretty striking similarities between Vina and Alta for sure. We do see that scene where Alta is messing with one of the crew members and, basically admits that she's kissed a bunch of them. But once the commander gets involved, the interaction between her and Adams is fairly similar to that of the interactions between Pike and Vina. So, yeah, that whole relationship is very similar.
So the other thing was I noticed that right off the bat, we're dealing with Talos 4 and Altair 4. So similar names of the planets.
Yeah, if Roddenberry had went with Altair, it maybe wouldn't have sounded so scary to you at first.
Maybe not, because I'm much less afraid of Altair than I am Talos.
Yeah.
Even though there's 4 Altairs as well, I'm just less frightened of it,
Yeah. While I was sitting there watching the, and this was, again, right after one of those times where I texted you, what's this have to do with Star Trek? Again, going back to the Krell machine scene, and then him taking them, Adams and his guy, down through the whole compound or whatever, with it being that big. I don't know if you can call it a compound.
Complex at that point, I believe, right?
Yeah, complex, whatever you want to call it. I don't know. I turned to my wife and I was like, this is as if the Telosians had died and a human found out how to do their illusion stuff. And then basically Morbius takes on the role of the Telosians there, especially when he was talking about humanity is not ready to receive none of this. Pretty much the same as the Telosians said about their illusion power. So that's how it felt to me, as if the Krell are the Telosians, Morbius is the intermediary between us and them, and he is playing gatekeeper to all that limitless power.
And since the Krell device that they were trying to figure out was basically you just think of something, now it exists, that's not very different from a illusion that is so realistic that you can interact with it, touch it, feel it, smell it, and whatever, you know?
Yeah.
Apparently, the Telosian illusions were so realistic that you go there as a crippled person in a wheelchair, you can get up and walk around and look young again. That's a pretty powerful illusion, if you ask me.
Yeah, actually, that's a better power than what the Krell had.
Yeah, so all those things, for me, while they're not necessarily identical or totally parallel, they are similar enough that I can draw a pretty straight line from Forbidden Planet to The Cage.
Well, to be fair, when I was watching it, my birthday was yesterday when I watched it, and I might have been a little inebriated while I was watching it.
Yeah, that's okay.
So maybe not thinking as clearly as I normally would. But yeah, I know I texted you that like once or twice, and every time that I texted it, it seemed like my answer was given to me on screen. So
right. Well, and you got to remember we were dealing with a movie that was about an hour and a half versus an episode that was about 42 minutes.
Oh no, the version that I watched was over 60 minutes.
The version of The Cage you watched was over 60?
Yeah, the one on Paramount right now. And that might have been why I felt like it dragged on.
Yeah, that could be.
But saying that, though, this kind of suffered from that same thing to me. There were a lot of scenes that could have been way shorter.
We're used to scenes that don't breathe as much as they used to. We got faster edits and quicker jumps between scenes. It's kind of interesting to watch because they used to leave in dialogue and stuff that didn't drive the plot forward. They don't really do that with things now. If it doesn't drive something forward, it's gone. It's cut out.
Yeah, I mean, filmmaking is super formulaic now. I mean, it probably was back then, too, because everybody was trying to make as much money as possible. But like I said, I don't consume a lot of content from before I was born, except for maybe music. But yeah, so I'm not as up on it as maybe I should be.
Yeah, see, I still watch a lot of old TV, like sitcoms and westerns, and, obviously the original Star Trek from 10, 15 years before I was born. I definitely am a bigger fan of old school sitcom writing because it was really formulaic. You can see through it almost from the beginning.
Yeah, I know a lot of people have problems with that. I personally don't. Normally when I'm watching something, I'm not watching it to pick it apart. I'm watching it to be entertained, and as long as you're doing that, I don't care how far away I can see your punchline.
Oh, yeah, no, me either. That's why I like the monsters, stuff like that. I don't care. I see what you're setting up already, and I love it anyways.
Actually, I don't know what you just said that jarred me to think about this, but I don't think we talked about the id monster that much except for the footprint scene.
No, we really haven't.
It kind of shows him, that monster, in the force field, and I thought that was really well done. Apparently some Disney animators did that. The only thing that I hated about that scene is the fact that while they were blasting that thing away, they didn't seem that into it. Like, they just were barely holding on to the blaster like it was nothing to shoot it. I could have done with like a shooting stance at least.
Yeah. I've always thought, because like they did this in Star Wars, since a lot of the guns in Star Wars were based on like actual World War II era pistols. They actually fired blanks. So it had some recoil when you pulled the trigger. And I think that's probably a lot easier to show some physicality when you actually have to physically kind of steady yourself against firing a weapon, and when you've just got like a prop.
Yeah, there was none of that in many of the scenes. I mean, some people like made a small effort, but most of them, they just were kind of standing in a regular stance, just pointing at the thing.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. And I have to wonder how many of those people were actual stage actors back then, and they're like, I'm here doing this laser gun, Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers crap when I want to be doing Shakespeare. You know, how much
Well,
that's
little
going
did they
on.
know they were doing Shakespeare.
They were, yeah. Bunch of suckers. But you know what I mean? Like those actor types, you know how they get. Some of them are real pretentious.
Yeah. I feel like that was definitely an issue with actors during that time, maybe even prior to that, like the so-called like golden age of Hollywood or whatever. I know you still hear about actors and actresses that act a fool like that, but I feel like it's way less common these days, or maybe I'm just super ignorant about it. I don't keep up with celebrity gossip, so maybe I'm just out of the loop.
Well, and I think now you have more people that want to be genre actors. You know, you have guys that got into it because they want to do sci-fi movies. Back then, you had people that wanted to be serious actors, and then, you know, you did a movie because you could make a bunch of money, then you can go do a stage play and, you know, have some fun. So there's probably, well, you know what? We've got a guest coming up sometime in the short future here, I hope, who is an actor who can fill us in a little more on that. We'll maybe save that discussion for when there's actually an expert with us.
Makes sense.
All right, Chris. Well, so that was the reason I wanted to watch Forbidden Planet.
Yeah. Now that I see everything in totality, it does make sense that you wanted to watch it. There are a lot of similarities to both The Cage and this movie, too. You know what? I may go my whole life without ever watching this movie again, but it was a good movie. It was a real good movie. Again, my favorite part about it was the visuals, especially considering it's from 1956. I really hated the soundtrack. I do understand what was going on with it, but I hated it. But yeah, I'm glad to have watched this movie. So thank you, sir.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, because I was going to feel really stupid if we got to the end of it and you're like, why did you make me watch that? You know, Jeremy, I thought we were friends. How come you made me watch that?
Even if I couldn't personally find any similarities to The Cage, it still was an entertaining movie, so it did its job.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, thank you for watching it, Chris. I'm glad you had a good impression. Where are we headed next week?
Oh, next week I think we're going to talk about the Kelvin timeline Pike. I don't know how much there is for that, but you know, we're going to find out next week.
Yeah. Well, everybody, thank you for listening. And if you have something to say to us, find us on Twitter at Strange Trek Show, or find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/Strange Trek. Remember to check out The Time Warp in Ashland, Kentucky, and on Facebook. Also, our big thanks to Miguel Esparza for our theme song. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next Planet of the Week.